Charleston, 1856. The first tendrils of dawn seeped reluctantly over the horizon, casting long, gray shadows across the cobblestone streets and the ornate iron gates of the city's wealthiest plantations. The air was heavy, thick with the lingering smoke of distant fires and the briny tang of the nearby harbor, yet it carried an almost imperceptible tension, as though the city itself were holding its breath. In this quiet, a solitary figure moved with deliberate caution, a young enslaved woman, pregnant and aware of the dangerous eyes that followed her every step. Her name, long since lost to most written records, was spoken in whispers among those who had seen her, yet to the wider town she was invisible, one more shadow among many in Charleston's tightly controlled social order. She moved with a blend of purpose and fear, her silhouette barely discernible in the pre-dawn light. The soft rustling of her skirt along the uneven stone seemed to echo unnaturally, filling the narrow alleys with a sound that was at once ordinary and strangely ominous. From behind shuttered windows, onlookers might have glimpsed her briefly, yet no one intervened, partly from fear, partly from the social blindness imposed by the rigid hierarchies of slavery. In her mind, every footstep was measured, every corner rounded with caution, because she knew that any misstep, any hint of defiance or deviation from her assigned path, could bring swift punishment or worse. And yet, there was something resolute in the way she moved, a quiet determination that defied the oppressive circumstances that sought to define her entirely. The narrative begins not with loud catastrophe, but with the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor of tension. The city itself seems to participate in her disappearance, its streets and buildings holding secret knowledge, whispering rumors to those attuned to them. The iron lampposts, unlit at this hour, stretched like skeletal sentinels into the fog, their shadows blending seamlessly with the creeping mist. The nearby harbor, usually bustling with morning labor, lay eerily still, its waters reflecting the dim glow of the early sky, broken only by the occasional ripple from a passing boat or the plaintive cry of a gull. The world she navigated was both familiar and threatening, and the narrative emphasizes the contrast between her fragile innocence and the immense darkness of the environment surrounding her. Her presence in the streets was more than a physical act, it was symbolic, a stark reminder of the precarious position of those enslaved within Charleston's tightly wound social hierarchy. She carried with her not only the weight of her pregnancy but also the unspoken knowledge of the consequences that would follow any deviation from the rules set by those in power. Each alley she passed seemed to offer both a potential escape and a potential trap. The narrative dwells on this tension, exploring how the city's architecture, with its winding lanes, shuttered doorways, and hidden passageways, becomes an accomplice to both her flight and her vulnerability. Even in these earliest moments, the story introduces subtle, almost imperceptible hints of the mystery to come. Something in the way the morning light fails to fully illuminate the streets, or in the way the mist seems to curl unnaturally around corners, suggests that Charleston is a city where normal rules may not apply. The young woman herself is a paradox of visibility and invisibility, seen by a few, yet largely ignored, her existence and her struggle largely erased from the official record. The narrative emphasizes this duality, framing her disappearance not merely as a personal tragedy but as a reflection of the broader systemic erasure of countless lives in the antebellum South. As she moves through the city, there is a sense of heightened awareness in the environment. Birds take flight at her passing, dogs bark in distant yards, and the faint sound of laborers preparing for the day reaches her ears. Yet nothing overtly threatens her at this moment, creating a slow-burning tension that keeps the audience suspended. The narrative deliberately avoids cheap shock or sudden violence, the horror is in the anticipation, in the realization that any misstep in this oppressive society could have irrevocable consequences. Every rustle, every whispered conversation, every glance from a shadowed window carries weight, hinting at forces both human and perhaps unknowable that could intervene at any moment. The young woman's psychological state is explored with careful attention to realism. Fear and resolve coexist uneasily within her. She remembers the stories whispered among the enslaved community, the cautionary tales of those who attempted escape or defiance, the hushed warnings of overseers' cruelty, and the ominous predictions passed down from one generation to the next. Her mind races with possibilities, weighing each step against the potential outcomes. The narrative lingers on this inner tension, emphasizing her intelligence, resilience, and vulnerability in equal measure. The audience begins to understand that the mystery is not only external but also profoundly internal, residing in the interplay between human psychology and the oppressive structures that surround her. As dawn breaks further, the city slowly begins to stir. Merchants open their shutters, carriages clatter across cobblestones, and the scent of baking bread wafts through narrow alleys. Yet the young woman's journey remains unseen by most, a ghostly movement that passes between the worlds of the visible and the invisible. The narrative contrasts this ordinary morning bustle with the extraordinary tension of her vanishing, reinforcing the story's central themes of erasure, suspense, and the collision between innocence and darkness. By the end of this section, the audience is fully immersed in the eerie, oppressive atmosphere of Charleston, intimately connected to the central figure, and emotionally invested in the unresolved tension surrounding her movements. The story has established its tone, slow-burning, atmospheric, grounded in realism, yet layered with subtle hints of mystery and foreboding. The disappearance is not sudden or sensationalized, it is a gradual, haunting event that leaves viewers suspended on the precipice of fear, curiosity, and moral reflection. The stage is set for the historical and social investigation that will follow, creating anticipation while maintaining an unsettling emotional resonance that lingers long after the opening scene has faded. The city of Charleston in the 1850s was a place of stark contrasts, a living paradox of elegance and oppression, prosperity and hidden despair. Its streets, lined with grandiose Georgian and Federal-style homes, seemed to promise refinement, culture, and order, yet beneath this polished veneer lay the weight of systemic cruelty and social inequality. The cobblestones echoed with the rhythmic clatter of horse-drawn carriages, but the spaces between the sounds were filled with whispers, secret movements, and the unspoken rules of a society structured to maintain rigid hierarchies. In this section, the story immerses the audience in Charleston's historical and social landscape, establishing a backdrop that is both beautiful and foreboding, a city whose aesthetic charm masks deep moral rot. The narrative begins with the geography of Charleston, drawing attention to its sprawling plantations, narrow streets, and the peculiar way the city's natural and man-made elements interact. Spanish moss drapes lazily from the oaks lining the streets, casting dancing shadows in the dim morning light. The harbor, usually alive with the bustle of trade, sometimes lies eerily still, reflecting the pastel hues of dawn in a way that makes the observer question the solidity of reality itself. Tides bring with them the scent of salt, smoke, and distant smoke from far-off chimneys, a mingling of odors that defines the sensory identity of the city. The story emphasizes these details, creating an atmospheric immersion that allows the audience to feel the oppressive, almost sentient presence of Charleston itself. Within this setting, the narrative introduces the social players and structures that dominate everyday life. Plantation owners, their wealth derived from the labor of enslaved people, move with a sense of entitlement that conceals both fear and obsession with control. Merchants and shopkeepers conduct their business under careful observation, aware that deviation from social norms could invite scandal or punishment. Meanwhile, the enslaved population navigates an invisible labyrinth of rules, threats, and opportunities for small acts of resistance. Their labor, essential to the functioning of the city and its economy, remains largely unacknowledged in the public eye. By juxtaposing the lives of the elite with those of the enslaved, the narrative highlights the stark contrasts and inherent tensions that permeate Charleston society, framing the city as a living organism whose every element is part of a delicate and dangerous ecosystem. The architecture itself contributes to the atmosphere. Grand homes with iron-laced balconies and elaborately carved doors project power and permanence, yet the alleys and back streets reveal decay and neglect, cracks in plaster and hidden corners where secrets fester. Street lamps, often unlit until nightfall, stretch like skeletal fingers across the foggy roads, their presence hinting at both illumination and threat. The narrative dwells on these contrasts, emphasizing how the physical environment mirrors the moral and social dichotomies of the city, beauty intertwined with cruelty, order intertwined with fear. This interplay between setting and society heightens the sense of suspense and foreboding, creating a backdrop where the central mystery feels almost inevitable. The daily rhythms of Charleston further reinforce this duality. Dawn brings laborers to the docks, merchants to their stalls, and the gentle hum of commerce across the city. Yet for those living in shadow, especially the enslaved, morning is not a promise of opportunity but a continuation of invisible surveillance, harsh discipline, and ceaseless work. Observers, both official and informal, monitor movements closely, noting deviations and cataloging behavior as a means of control. The young pregnant woman from the opening scene moves through this environment, acutely aware of the constant watchfulness that surrounds her. The narrative captures this tension in cinematic detail: the sound of a carriage wheel clattering too close, the faint murmur of voices from a balcony, the brief gleam of a watchful eye in the half-light. Each detail contributes to an oppressive, almost claustrophobic sensation, immersing the audience in both place and psychological reality. In this section, the story also examines Charleston's role as a social and economic hub. The city thrives on trade, commerce, and culture, yet its prosperity is inseparable from the labor extracted from the enslaved population. Rice, cotton, and indigo flow through its ports, creating wealth that funds lavish homes, ornate churches, and public festivals. Meanwhile, the laborers who sustain this economy are confined to the shadows, their lives meticulously controlled and their stories largely erased. The narrative emphasizes the tension between visibility and invisibility, between the city's celebrated elegance and the hidden suffering that underpins it. This contrast forms a central thematic current, reinforcing the eerie, morally complex atmosphere in which the central mystery will unfold. The cultural and religious landscape of Charleston adds another layer to the city's shadowed character. Churches dominate the skyline, their spires reaching toward the heavens while their congregations often enforce strict moral codes and social conformity. Religious leaders wield influence not only over spiritual matters but also over the daily lives of residents, interpreting events in ways that align with prevailing ideologies. Folklore and superstition intermingle with formal doctrine, creating a climate where unseen forces and moral judgments coexist, shaping both perception and action. The narrative explores this dimension to illustrate how belief and social expectation interact with reality, coloring interpretations of the young woman's disappearance and amplifying the psychological tension that permeates the city. The city's streets themselves are treated almost as characters. Alleyways, narrow lanes, and hidden courtyards provide both refuge and danger, spaces where secrets can thrive unnoticed or where punishment can be exacted swiftly. The story emphasizes the interplay between light and shadow, open thoroughfares and confined spaces, public spectacle and private terror. Observers may glimpse figures moving through these spaces, but the true nature of their actions remains obscured, heightening suspense. The pregnant woman's movements through these streets are traced with precision, her path weaving between safety and exposure, each step laden with risk. This careful attention to spatial detail contributes to a cinematic experience, allowing the audience to visualize and feel the tension inherent in Charleston's physical and social architecture. By the end of this section, Charleston is established as a city that is at once magnificent and morally decayed, where beauty conceals cruelty, and public order masks private terror. The audience understands that the environment itself is complicit in the unfolding mystery, shaping perceptions, movements, and possibilities. Suspense is maintained not through sudden events but through the accumulation of detail, the layering of social, architectural, and psychological elements that immerse the viewer fully in place and time. The stage is set for the subtle, sinister developments that will propel the story forward, situating the central figure's disappearance within a city that is as much a participant as any human actor, alive with shadowed intention and historical weight. The earliest stirrings of unease did not emerge from the halls of Charleston's grand homes or from the bustling docks where commerce dictated the rhythm of the city. They arose instead from the narrow quarters, hidden kitchens, and secretive spaces occupied by the enslaved community, a network of human lives bound together by both suffering and resilience. In these confined areas, word traveled differently, softly, deliberately, and often shrouded in metaphor and coded language, a necessity born of constant surveillance. The young pregnant woman became a focal point of this quiet attention, her movements noticed, her presence felt, yet always filtered through layers of discretion. In this section, the narrative delves into the perspective of those who were forced to witness, to interpret, and to respond to events without the authority or freedom to intervene openly. Rumors began as faint whispers, passing from one trusted ear to another. Some spoke of sightings in alleyways long abandoned by the city's elite, where shadows clung like sentient beings and the air carried an unusual chill. Others recounted the pregnant woman's inexplicable behavior, moments when she seemed unusually alert, when her eyes scanned corners and windows with an awareness that transcended ordinary caution. The narrative emphasizes the tension inherent in these observations, presenting them not as sensationalized events but as subtle deviations from the norms of daily life. Each anecdote is layered with uncertainty, allowing the audience to inhabit the fear, vigilance, and moral complexity of the enslaved witnesses. This quiet observation carried a psychological weight. Within the enslaved community, stories were rarely straightforward, they were encoded with caution, with warnings, and with hints of meaning that could be fatal if misunderstood by overseers. Every unusual movement of the pregnant woman was analyzed for intent, danger, or omen. Children listened attentively, absorbing the lessons woven into hushed conversations, while adults weighed the potential consequences of sharing information or taking action. The narrative explores the delicate balance between curiosity, empathy, and self-preservation, portraying the community's awareness as both a form of intelligence and a survival mechanism. The pregnant woman's presence, her choices, and her fears are filtered through this prism, heightening the story's suspense while grounding it in historical and psychological realism. The whispers also carried a folkloric undertone. In a society where formal education was denied and religious interpretations permeated everyday life, unexplained phenomena were often framed in terms of the supernatural or the morally instructive. Some claimed to have seen fleeting glimpses of her figure in unexpected places, accompanied by strange sounds or a sudden chill in the air. Others suggested that her pregnancy, combined with her unusual resolve and composure, marked her as someone touched by forces beyond the ordinary. The narrative treats these claims with subtlety, neither confirming nor denying them, instead using them to create a sense of layered mystery. The tension arises not from spectacle but from the interplay of belief, fear, and observation within a tightly controlled social hierarchy. The community's awareness was not passive. Small acts of communication, shared glances, gestures, coded words, allowed people to track her movements, anticipate danger, and offer aid when possible. These interactions, though understated, are laden with emotional intensity. The narrative emphasizes how human connection persisted despite systemic oppression, illustrating resilience and moral courage in a world structured to erase autonomy. By highlighting these networks of observation and support, the story demonstrates that the pregnant woman was never entirely alone, even as the forces arrayed against her remained immense and impersonal. The early anomalies observed were subtle yet compelling. Doors found ajar without explanation, fleeting glimpses of figures retreating into darkness, or whispered warnings of overseers moving through alleys, all contributed to a growing sense of unease. The narrative slows to examine these moments in detail, describing the environment, the timing, and the reactions of witnesses. Every small detail is imbued with tension, the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of wind through a shutter, the fleeting glimmer of light on iron railings. These elements collectively establish a cinematic atmosphere, emphasizing suspense over overt action and creating an emotional resonance that draws the audience deeply into the lived experience of Charleston's hidden observers. The story also explores the psychological toll of maintaining constant vigilance. For those in the enslaved community, awareness of the pregnant woman's plight required navigating fear, loyalty, and the moral imperative to act. Sleep was fitful, conversations were guarded, every movement carried the potential for exposure and punishment. The narrative examines these pressures in cinematic detail, tracing the subtle signs of strain, from a clenched jaw to the hurried steps of someone retreating from a doorway. Through these observations, the audience comes to understand not only the tension of the moment but also the broader, relentless oppression shaping the behavior of every individual in the community. Interwoven with the narrative of observation is an exploration of social cohesion and informal governance within the enslaved community. Elders, who had weathered decades of oversight and control, served as custodians of knowledge, passing on guidance in ways that were both practical and symbolic. They interpreted events, advised caution, and framed the pregnant woman's disappearance in moral and ethical terms, blending survival strategies with cultural memory. These dynamics are described with nuance, showing how community structure, history, and intuition intersected to create a network of quiet intelligence capable of both interpreting and subtly influencing events. The narrative also examines the pregnant woman's own agency within these observations. While much of the community's attention is focused on her movements, the story emphasizes her deliberate actions, her calculated caution, and her awareness of both danger and opportunity. She navigates the alleys and hidden spaces with an understanding of surveillance and power dynamics that rivals that of her watchers. The audience is invited to appreciate her resilience and intelligence, even in the context of extreme vulnerability. By portraying her as both subject and object of attention, the narrative creates a layered psychological tension, deepening the suspense and humanizing the central figure in ways that resonate emotionally. As the section draws to a close, the whispers and observations begin to coalesce into a broader understanding that something extraordinary, or at least inexplicable, is occurring. The pregnant woman's movements, the subtle anomalies, and the community's careful interpretation of events create a dense atmosphere of suspense and anticipation. The narrative emphasizes that while no one yet fully comprehends the nature of the mystery, the tension is palpable, the stakes are high, and the moral and psychological pressures of Charleston's social order weigh heavily on all who bear witness. The stage is set for escalation, as the quiet knowledge of the enslaved community becomes a lens through which the audience will begin to perceive the deeper, more unsettling truths underlying the city's veneer of order. By the end of this section, the audience is intimately connected with the perspective of those forced to observe in silence, attuned to the subtleties of fear, resilience, and coded communication. The story achieves a slow-burning suspense that is both emotionally resonant and historically grounded, drawing the viewer deeper into the unfolding mystery. The narrative leaves the audience on the precipice of tension, aware that the seemingly small anomalies and whispers will soon escalate into events that will challenge perception, morality, and human understanding within the city of Charleston. While whispers and subtle observations circulated quietly among Charleston's enslaved community, the overseers and authorities of the city remained largely unaware, or willfully indifferent, to the undercurrents of unease. Their gaze, sharpened for control but limited in scope, was focused on the visible and the immediately disruptive. In this section, the narrative examines how structured authority, habituated to enforcing rules and maintaining appearances, failed to perceive the unfolding mystery until it had already begun to spiral beyond their comprehension. The tension emerges not from immediate conflict but from the dangerous combination of oversight, negligence, and the moral blindness that enabled a young pregnant woman to vanish under their noses. The overseers' routines were rigid, almost mechanical. From the early morning roll calls to the inspection of laborers on the plantations, every action was designed to establish control and project dominance. Yet within this structure, subtler human dynamics, the quiet signals, the whispered alerts, the signs of fear or defiance, went unnoticed or were dismissed as inconsequential. The narrative emphasizes this selective perception, illustrating the stark contrast between the vigilance of the enslaved community and the inattentive authority figures who, despite outward power, lacked the awareness to address threats that were not immediately tangible. The pregnant woman's movements, her cautious navigation of streets and alleys, slipped past their notice, not due to her cleverness alone, but because of the systemic blindness and hubris of those tasked with oversight. Initial reports of anomalies reached the authorities in fragments: a half-glimpsed figure in an alley, a missing laborer for a few hours, murmurs of unease that were quickly suppressed or rationalized. These incidents were brushed aside with explanations that suited the convenient narratives of order and obedience. Perhaps she had wandered off on a personal errand, perhaps she had been delayed by the chores of the morning. In any case, the formal response was minimal: occasional inquiries, perfunctory searches, and the reassertion of discipline, all of which reinforced the illusion of control while leaving critical gaps in understanding. The narrative emphasizes this procedural inadequacy, portraying the overseers as both powerful and tragically limited, capable of enforcing minor discipline yet blind to the broader forces at work. The blind eye of authority is further explored through the psychology of denial and self-preservation. Overseers were acutely aware that failure reflected not only on their competence but on the perceived stability of the plantation system itself. Admitting that something inexplicable had occurred, that an enslaved woman had moved beyond their grasp, threatened both reputation and power. Consequently, rationalizations multiplied, and anomalies were minimized, dismissed, or buried beneath layers of bureaucratic and social conventions. The narrative underscores how human ego, fear of accountability, and the desire to maintain an illusion of absolute control contributed to the slow recognition of the mystery, allowing the pregnant woman's presence and eventual disappearance to proceed largely unimpeded. The story also examines the moral dimensions of this inattention. The overseer's neglect was not merely procedural but profoundly ethical, reflecting the dehumanization inherent in slavery. Their indifference allowed danger to thrive unchallenged, not because the events were unknowable, but because the subjects were considered less than fully human. This moral blindness creates a chilling subtext, reminding the audience that the societal structures themselves, more than any individual malevolence, facilitated the unfolding tragedy. The narrative draws attention to the contrast between the observant enslaved community, who read every nuance for signs of threat, and the authority figures, who were capable of enormous harm yet remained incapable of perceiving subtle signs of risk to the very lives they controlled. Despite the apparent inattention, the overseer's presence is not entirely absent. The narrative details moments of superficial vigilance, the clatter of boots along cobblestones, the occasional shouting of orders, the watchful eyes scanning the crowd from balconies or doorways. These interventions, however, are limited to maintaining visible order, controlling labor, and enforcing compliance. The deeper, more insidious layers of human behavior, the movements of someone intent on avoiding detection, the coded communications among enslaved observers, the subtle anomalies in the city's rhythms, remain beyond their grasp. The tension arises precisely from this asymmetry. Authority is present, imposing, and threatening, yet simultaneously blind, enabling the mystery to deepen in its shadow. Subtle failures in communication compound the problem. Reports from plantation hands or informal witnesses were often filtered through layers of hierarchy, each level interpreting events according to convenience, self-interest, or fear. Observations that might have alerted authorities were diluted into ambiguity, dismissed as coincidence, or deliberately ignored. The narrative emphasizes the cumulative effect of these oversights, illustrating how structural inefficiency and selective perception create fertile ground for mystery. Each minor lapse, when compounded across multiple individuals and days, amplifies suspense while reinforcing the historical reality of a society in which control was both absolute and inherently fragile. The pregnant woman's actions intersect with these blind spots in ways that intensify the tension. She navigates paths calculated to avoid attention, timing her movements to coincide with gaps in oversight and exploiting the very routines that enforce order. The narrative traces these maneuvers in cinematic detail, describing the alleys she chooses, the shadowed corners she passes, and the subtle cues she reads from the environment. The audience gains an appreciation for both her intelligence and the systemic vulnerabilities that allow her evasion to succeed, deepening emotional engagement and suspense without resorting to sensationalism. The overseer's failure is further highlighted through contrasting moments when the enslaved community perceives danger instantly. Where a glance, a creak, or a sudden shift in wind alerts those attuned to the subtleties of surveillance, the formal authorities remain oblivious, following predictable patterns of oversight. This disparity underscores the psychological tension of the narrative, framing the mystery not as an isolated event but as a consequence of structural imbalance, human arrogance, and the limitations imposed by rigid social hierarchies. It also magnifies the audience's emotional investment, generating a slow-burning dread rooted in anticipation rather than immediate spectacle. By the end of this section, the narrative has established the overseers as figures of both authority and vulnerability, blind to forces they cannot or will not recognize. Their mechanical routines, selective perception, and moral indifference set the stage for escalating suspense, positioning the audience to understand how a young pregnant woman could navigate the city and its dangers under the very noses of those sworn to control her. The story highlights the interplay of observation and ignorance, power and helplessness, foreshadowing the psychological and social tensions that will propel the unfolding mystery. Authority is present, yet inadequate, threatening, yet impotent. The city is watched, yet the most crucial events remain unseen. Through these detailed explorations, Charleston's mechanisms of control are revealed as simultaneously oppressive and flawed, creating the conditions for the pregnant woman's disappearance to gain momentum. The narrative leaves the audience suspended, aware that the blind eye of authority is not merely a plot device but a historically grounded element that amplifies the story's eeriness, realism, and suspense. The stage is fully set for the next phase of tension, as social, moral, and psychological forces converge to deepen the mystery in ways both subtle and profoundly unsettling. As the days passed following the pregnant woman's increasingly conspicuous absences, the city of Charleston became a conduit for speculation, superstition, and whispered conjecture. The enslaved community, ever vigilant, continued to circulate stories, each retelling amplified by fear, empathy, or moral interpretation. Yet, these murmurs soon reached the wider population, filtering through the town's social layers in fragmented, distorted ways. Clergy, merchants, and plantation owners began to interpret the unexplained events through their own lenses, through sermons, conversations, and the moral frameworks they had long imposed upon their lives. In this section, the narrative explores how rumor and religious interpretation combined to shape perception, heightening both intrigue and dread. Charleston's churches, imposing structures of brick and stone, dominated the city's skyline and its collective imagination. Spires pointed heavenward, signaling spiritual authority, yet within their walls, sermons often served to reinforce social hierarchies and moral conformity. The narrative describes these spaces in detail: sun-dappled interiors, heavy pews polished by decades of use, and the hush of congregants listening with rapt attention. Clergy addressed the congregation not only with spiritual guidance but with social instruction, interpreting events through theological frameworks that positioned unexplained occurrences as moral lessons or divine tests. When rumors of the pregnant woman's unusual behavior and her mysterious disappearances reached these pulpits, they were folded into narratives of sin, providence, and the dangers of deviation from societal norms. The townspeople, receptive to such interpretations, found themselves caught between fear and fascination. Gossip circulated like wildfire, distorted with each retelling, and in these distortions, the young woman's story began to take on a symbolic weight. She was no longer merely an individual, she became a cautionary figure, a symbol of vulnerability, defiance, and mysterious providence. Observers claimed to glimpse her in fleeting, improbable moments, slipping along shadowed corridors, appearing where no one expected, or vanishing entirely from sight. These accounts, often secondhand and contradictory, blurred the line between fact and folklore, creating a layered tapestry of suspense and psychological tension. The narrative emphasizes this duality, allowing the audience to inhabit both the rational skepticism and the almost instinctive dread that characterized Charleston's reaction. Within the enslaved community, these rumors were parsed carefully. Knowledge of religious doctrine, folk beliefs, and survival strategies intertwined to form a complex interpretive system. Elders and midwives, familiar with the rhythms of the city and the intricacies of social control, offered their own readings. Perhaps the woman's actions were guided by divine intervention, or perhaps by ancestral spirits seeking to protect or warn. Such interpretations provided both guidance and comfort, while maintaining caution against indiscretion. The narrative highlights the tension between these layered beliefs and the practical realities of oppression, showing how superstition and strategy coexisted in ways that were psychologically and socially adaptive. The pregnant woman's own perception of these circulating rumors is explored with subtle psychological nuance. She would have been aware, at least indirectly, of the growing attention, the whispered interpretations, and the moralized narratives forming around her. Each glance from a passerby, each hushed conversation, carried meaning she could not ignore. Yet she moved with a measured awareness, balancing the need for caution with an inner resolve that defied the moral and social frameworks attempting to contain her. The narrative emphasizes this interplay between observer and observed, creating tension while humanizing the central figure, illustrating both her intelligence and the pressures she endured. Religious interpretations often cast the pregnant woman's plight in terms of moral consequence and divine retribution. Clergy emphasize the dangers of transgression and the need for obedience, framing her disappearances as potential punishment for sin or signs of spiritual testing. Sermons evoked fear, portraying unseen forces watching over the city and reinforcing conformity. The narrative portrays these dynamics with careful attention to historical realism. Rather than overtly sensationalizing supernatural elements, it highlights the psychological weight these beliefs imposed, showing how perception and expectation could shape social behavior, heighten fear, and amplify the mystery surrounding her movements. At the same time, the rumors that circulated among Charleston's elite were tinged with suspicion and scandal. Observers speculated about hidden liaisons, clandestine acts of defiance, or the potential for betrayal within the enslaved population. Plantation owners and merchants, seeking to maintain control, interpreted anomalies as threats to order, reinforcing surveillance and coercion. This created a feedback loop in which fear and rumor drove action, and action, in turn, generated further speculation. The narrative examines this cycle, emphasizing how perception and authority were intertwined, and how the pregnant woman's disappearance became a mirror reflecting the city's anxieties, moral contradictions, and latent violence. The story also explores the interplay of folklore and lived experience. In a society where knowledge was closely guarded and access to formal education restricted, myth and legend often filled gaps in understanding. Witnesses recounted moments that seemed impossible, a figure vanishing behind a wall, the sound of hurried footsteps where none could have passed, or a fleeting shadow that defied explanation. These accounts were seldom verified, yet they carried emotional truth, shaping perceptions, influencing behavior, and contributing to an atmosphere of suspense and uncertainty. The narrative treats these elements with subtlety, neither confirming nor dismissing them, but using them to heighten tension and deepen the audience's immersion in the social and psychological landscape of Charleston. In addition to rumor and superstition, practical measures were attempted. Searches, inquiries, and questioning of witnesses occurred sporadically, often motivated as much by fear of social scandal as by genuine concern for the missing woman. These efforts were largely ineffective, hampered by the same structural blindness and moral indifference that characterized the overseer's attention. Yet the narrative emphasizes that even failed interventions contributed to the growing tension, as each misstep, each inconclusive search, heightened the sense of danger and uncertainty for both the community and the central figure. By the end of this section, the audience is acutely aware of the layered perceptions surrounding the pregnant woman, whispers among the enslaved, distorted rumors in the wider city, and moralized interpretations through religious and cultural lenses. Charleston emerges as a city alive with observation, speculation, and partial understanding, yet fundamentally incapable of comprehending the full truth. Suspense is maintained through the interplay of belief, fear, and moral expectation, situating the central mystery within a rich tapestry of social, psychological, and spiritual dynamics. The narrative leaves viewers poised for escalation, understanding that the growing attention, both subtle and overt, will intersect with the unfolding events in ways that intensify danger, intrigue, and emotional resonance. This section establishes the pregnant woman's story not merely as a factual disappearance but as a symbol within a network of perception and interpretation. It underscores the interplay of rumor, religious authority, and social hierarchy, creating an environment in which mystery can thrive and suspense can build naturally. The stage is now fully set for escalation, as the intersecting forces of observation, belief, and authority converge, driving the narrative toward the psychological and social pressures that will define the next phase of the story. The whispers, rumors, and moralized interpretations that had circulated through Charleston eventually reached a point where authorities could no longer ignore the pregnant woman's disappearance. In this section, the narrative follows the first attempts at investigation, tracing the procedural steps, the limitations of 19th-century record-keeping, and the human factors that constrained understanding. The investigation begins not with dramatic revelation, but with meticulous documentation, interviews, and small, painstaking searches, actions that reveal both the earnestness and the inadequacy of those tasked with uncovering the truth. Initial inquiries were cautious and constrained. Overseers, merchants, and plantation owners dispatched individuals to trace her movements, relying on limited eyewitness accounts and the fragmented reports passed along by the enslaved community. Each account was colored by fear, memory, and interpretation, creating a tangled web of information that was difficult to reconcile. The narrative emphasizes this ambiguity, describing how search parties moved through narrow alleys, plantation fields, and hidden courtyards, documenting what they found while constantly confronted by gaps in knowledge. Their methods, though systematic by the standards of the day, were ill-suited to capturing the subtle nuances of human behavior, creating a tension between intent and effectiveness. Witness interviews were conducted with uneven diligence. Those who had seen her were questioned, yet social hierarchies influenced both the willingness to speak and the interpretation of testimony. Enslaved individuals, fearful of reprisal, offered partial accounts, often framed in coded language that required careful reading. Meanwhile, overseers and local officials interpreted these statements through a lens of skepticism or convenience, filtering the information to fit preconceived narratives. The narrative dwells on the dissonance between observation and interpretation, illustrating how human perception, hierarchy, and fear intersect to complicate even the simplest investigative efforts. Maps, rudimentary charts, and written notes were employed to track her possible movements. Investigators attempted to reconstruct her last known locations and the sequence of events leading to her disappearance. Yet the city itself, with its labyrinthine streets, hidden courtyards, and shifting shadows, resisted clear comprehension. The narrative describes these spaces in cinematic detail: the narrow alleys where sunlight struggled to penetrate, the iron gates that concealed more than they revealed, the quiet corners where time seemed suspended. Each location became a site of both search and uncertainty, enhancing suspense and highlighting the psychological pressure on those attempting to enforce order in a world increasingly opaque. The early theories proposed by investigators were cautious, reflecting both rational inquiry and the biases of the time. Some speculated that she had attempted to flee, seeking freedom beyond the city's boundaries. Others suggested that she had been hidden by sympathetic members of the enslaved community, an interpretation that simultaneously acknowledged agency and imposed risk. A few considered accidental death or natural causes, while still others incorporated moral and religious frameworks, viewing her absence as divine punishment or a consequence of personal transgression. The narrative carefully presents each theory, examining its plausibility and the evidence, or lack thereof, that supported it, creating a layered sense of suspense grounded in reason rather than sensationalism. Search parties were organized with uneven coordination and effectiveness. Overseers, servants, and local volunteers scoured streets, alleys, and plantation fields, calling her name and observing for signs of movement. The narrative emphasizes the tension inherent in these efforts, the dissonance between visible activity and actual insight, the contrast between the city's bustling daily rhythms and the unseen gaps where she might have slipped through unnoticed. Each failed search increased anxiety and speculation, while also demonstrating the limitations of authority and procedure when faced with subtlety, human cunning, and systemic oversight. Documentation and record-keeping were central to the first investigation, yet they revealed as much about societal structure as they did about the disappearance itself. Notes were often incomplete, biased, or contradictory, details were lost or misinterpreted, and the identities of key witnesses were obscured by fear or hierarchy. The narrative presents these failures not as plot devices but as historically grounded obstacles, highlighting the difficulty of capturing reality in a society where surveillance was selective and social structures inhibited truthful reporting. In doing so, the story reinforces suspense and realism, showing how procedural thoroughness can be undermined by human limitation. The psychological impact on investigators is explored in subtle, cinematic detail. They experienced frustration, doubt, and occasional panic as evidence failed to coalesce into coherent understanding. Questions arose regarding competence, oversight, and the possibility of deliberate obstruction, both from within the enslaved community and among authorities themselves. The narrative emphasizes the tension between authority and uncertainty, illustrating how even those trained to enforce order could feel powerless when confronted with events that defied prediction, comprehension, or moral clarity. The narrative also explores the pregnant woman's continued agency during this phase. She moved with awareness, calculating steps to avoid detection, timing her appearances to coincide with gaps in oversight and relying on the networks of communication within her community. This strategic navigation underscores her intelligence and resilience, heightening suspense by demonstrating that the mystery is not merely the result of human error, but also of her deliberate action. The audience is encouraged to recognize the interplay between evasion and oversight, creating layered tension grounded in psychological realism. By the end of this section, the first investigation has produced no definitive answers. Gaps in knowledge, procedural shortcomings, and the deliberate caution of witnesses leave investigators frustrated and increasingly uncertain. The audience perceives both the earnestness and the impotence of the initial search efforts, and the narrative prepares for escalation. The stage is set for increasing tension, as subsequent anomalies, social pressures, and psychological strain will push the city, the authorities, and the community into a deeper, more suspenseful confrontation with the unknown. The investigation, while incomplete and flawed, serves to crystallize the stakes. The pregnant woman's disappearance is not only a personal tragedy but a reflection of systemic neglect, fear, and moral blindness. Authority exists, but it is fragmented, attention is applied, but unevenly. As a result, suspense and dread accumulate organically, emphasizing the slow-burning nature of the mystery and preparing the audience for the intensification of events that will follow. The narrative leaves viewers on the precipice of revelation and danger, fully aware that the unresolved gaps in the investigation are fertile ground for both psychological tension and historical intrigue. As the first investigation faltered under the weight of incomplete information and structural blind spots, subtle anomalies began to emerge across Charleston. These were not overt events, nor were they violent in the traditional sense, rather, they were the signs in the shadows, the small, almost imperceptible occurrences that hinted at forces, human or otherwise, moving just beyond comprehension. In this section, the narrative shifts focus to the eerie patterns and strange coincidences that began to accumulate, weaving suspense through visual detail, environmental tension, and psychological unease. The audience is invited to perceive the city differently, as if Charleston itself were an active participant in the unfolding mystery. The pregnant woman's movements became increasingly enigmatic, leaving traces that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Footprints. Appearing in unlikely locations, doors slightly ajar when they had been locked, and fleeting glimpses of her silhouette in alleys and courtyards suggested both presence and absence simultaneously. Investigators, observers, and members of the enslaved community all noted these anomalies, but each interpreted them through the lens of expectation and fear. The narrative emphasizes the ambiguity of perception, showing how ordinary events, a misplaced object, a shadow cast by a passing carriage, a shutter moving in the wind, could take on a heightened significance when filtered through collective anxiety. The environment of Charleston itself contributed to this sense of unreality. Fog rolled in from the harbor, thickening in the early morning and muffling sound while obscuring visibility. The tall oaks draped in Spanish moss cast elongated shadows that twisted across cobblestone streets, creating optical illusions that suggested movement where none existed. The narrative dwells on these atmospheric details, emphasizing the interplay of light, shadow, and architecture in amplifying suspense. Even the city's familiar rhythms, the clatter of horses, the murmur of merchants, the distant tolling of church bells, could suddenly seem out of sync, lending the impression of a world slightly off balance, or reality bending subtly around the pregnant woman's presence. Local residents began to notice patterns, subtle repetitions that defied casual explanation. A street where she was last seen would later appear undisturbed, yet those passing through reported a sense of being watched. Objects in the homes of the enslaved community sometimes shifted overnight, small but deliberate, hinting at the pregnant woman's careful navigation through hidden spaces. The narrative describes these observations in cinematic detail, the glint of light on an iron latch, the soft rustle of a curtain moved by an unseen hand, the slight indentations in soil that suggested footsteps without origin. Each observation builds tension, drawing the audience into a world where certainty is impossible and every shadow carries potential significance. The reactions of those witnessing these signs are central to the suspense. Members of the enslaved community interpreted anomalies as warnings, opportunities, or omens, blending practical survival knowledge with spiritual and cultural understanding. Overseers and authorities, by contrast, struggled to reconcile the inconsistencies with their rigid frameworks of control, often dismissing events as coincidence or imagining explanations that preserved their sense of order. The narrative emphasizes this divergence in perception, heightening tension by showing how the same phenomena could produce drastically different psychological and social responses depending on the observer's position within the city's hierarchy. At the same time, the pregnant woman herself is depicted as an active agent within these patterns. She leaves behind traces intentionally, whether to mislead, communicate, or protect herself. Her understanding of the city's layout, the predictability of human behavior, and the surveillance patterns allows her to manipulate perception subtly. The narrative explores her strategies in detail, showing how her choices intersect with environmental features, the placement of shadows, the timing of dawn and dusk, the movement of other residents, to maintain a degree of control despite her vulnerable position. This duality, of being both observed and observing, intensifies suspense while underscoring her intelligence and resilience. Strange coincidences began to accumulate, blurring the line between natural causality and inexplicable phenomena. A child might report seeing her silhouette in a doorway long after she had passed, or an adult might notice a shadow where none should exist. Wind chimes would sway without wind, distant footsteps would echo down abandoned alleys, and fleeting glimpses of movement would vanish upon closer inspection. The narrative treats these occurrences with subtlety, presenting them as potential anomalies without sensationalizing them, maintaining an atmosphere of slow-burning dread rooted in ambiguity, perception, and human psychology. The city's reaction to these signs was compounded by social and religious frameworks. Preachers spoke in hushed tones of divine intervention or moral warning, reinforcing the sense that unseen forces were at work. Rumors circulated that her disappearance and the strange occurrences were connected to punishment or protection from higher powers. The enslaved community interpreted the same signs through practical and spiritual lenses, balancing caution, moral obligation, and protective strategy. These layered interpretations create a cinematic tension, as viewers perceive the same events through multiple, sometimes conflicting perspectives, deepening both suspense and emotional resonance. The narrative also emphasizes the psychological strain these signs inflicted on both observers and participants. Anxiety heightened as ordinary patterns became unreliable, and trust in perception was eroded. Sleep became fragmented for those most attuned to the anomalies, conversations carried undercurrents of fear and speculation. Even authority figures, accustomed to enforcing order, experienced growing unease as evidence became inconsistent, contradictory, or unexplainable. The story explores these effects subtly, showing how the accumulation of minor, unexplained events can destabilize both individual cognition and collective social dynamics, intensifying suspense without overt dramatization. The pregnant woman's evolving strategies intersect with the city's natural and human rhythms, creating a series of calculated, high-stakes movements. She manipulates the timing of exposure and concealment, exploiting gaps in oversight, natural shadows, and patterns of daily activity. The narrative traces these maneuvers with cinematic clarity, emphasizing tension in every step, glance, and pause. The audience becomes attuned not only to her presence but to the broader interplay of observation, anticipation, and environmental factors that amplify the mystery, reinforcing the slow-burning suspense that defines the story's tone. By the end of this section, Charleston has been fully established as a city alive with subtle, unsettling signs, shadows that suggest movement, environmental cues that defy expectation, and anomalies that strain belief and perception. The pregnant woman exists at the center of these disturbances, both shaping and responding to them, while observers, enslaved and free, authorities and citizens, interpret them through lenses of fear, superstition, and hierarchy. The narrative leaves the audience on edge, aware that each small anomaly is part of a larger, unresolved pattern, and primed for the escalating tension, failed explanations, and psychological unraveling that will follow. The story has now shifted from investigation to observation, from outward procedural effort to inward reflection on perception, cognition, and environmental influence. The pregnant woman's disappearance is no longer merely a logistical or moral puzzle, it has become a complex network of shadows, signs, and human psychology, setting the stage for the next phase, where attempts at rational explanation collide with accumulating unease, failure, and the inexorable progression of suspense. As the signs in the shadows intensified, the pregnant woman's world began to shrink. The city of Charleston, once a bustling center of commerce and social activity, became a labyrinth of uncertainty and danger. Every alley, courtyard, and plantation field presented both opportunity and threat. In this section, the narrative focuses on her increasing isolation, the psychological weight of being pursued and observed, and the gradual erosion of certainties that previously governed her life. The sense of vanishing is both literal and symbolic, as her movements become increasingly deliberate, subtle, and concealed, threading suspense through every carefully chosen step. Isolation for the pregnant woman was multidimensional. Physical separation from those who could offer protection was compounded by social and psychological alienation. The enslaved community remained a source of vigilance and coded communication, but the constraints of secrecy and fear meant that she could trust few fully. Each act of navigation, through hidden alleys, along riverbanks shrouded in fog, or across plantation fields, required precise timing, constant awareness of observers, and a deep understanding of social dynamics. The narrative emphasizes the tension inherent in such constrained movement, portraying the city as both a protective shield and a potential trap, each shadowed corner carrying a duality of concealment and exposure. The vanishing point becomes both a literal and symbolic motif. As the pregnant woman moved through Charleston, she carefully calculated where she could disappear from view, creating moments in which she existed at the threshold between presence and absence. The narrative describes these spaces with cinematic precision: a narrow alley where sunlight barely penetrates, a walled garden offering temporary refuge, a cluster of warehouses concealing movements behind weathered shutters. These thresholds become stages for suspense, emphasizing how her understanding of environment and human behavior allowed her to manipulate perception, evade detection, and maintain a fragile autonomy within a city structured to deny it. The narrative also explores the psychological strain of isolation. The pregnant woman's awareness of constant surveillance, combined with the ever-present threat of punishment or violence, created a heightened state of alertness that demanded extraordinary mental discipline. Sleep was fitful and interrupted, and every sound, footsteps, distant voices, the clatter of a carriage, triggered a cascade of calculations. The audience is immersed in these internal experiences, sensing the tension between fear and resolve, vulnerability and agency. Her isolation is not merely physical but deeply emotional, generating suspense that is both intimate and universal. Observers continue to play a critical role in this dynamic, even as the woman's movements became more clandestine. Members of the enslaved community monitored patterns, conveyed warnings through coded gestures, and facilitated navigation through the city's hidden spaces. Yet these acts of support were necessarily indirect, constrained by fear and social hierarchies. Meanwhile, overseers and authorities, increasingly frustrated by the apparent unpredictability of events, intensified searches and patrols. The narrative contrasts the subtle, intelligent coordination of the community with the mechanical, often ineffective methods of formal oversight, highlighting a tension between perception and power, strategy and authority. The environment of Charleston amplifies the sense of vanishing. Mist rising from the harbor transforms familiar streets into a shifting maze. Iron gates, half-lit courtyards, and shuttered windows create a network of concealment. The narrative dwells on the sensory experience of these spaces, the damp smell of sea air, the uneven texture of cobblestones underfoot, the flicker of candlelight in distant rooms. Each element contributes to the pregnant woman's ability to disappear temporarily, to manipulate attention and perception, and to maintain control over what others could or could not see. The city itself becomes a partner in evasion, its architecture, weather, and human rhythms shaping the trajectory of suspense. Social and moral pressures add to the weight of isolation. The pregnant woman is not only evading physical detection but navigating layers of ethical and cultural expectation. Religious authority, gossip, and hierarchical enforcement all contribute to a landscape in which her choices are scrutinized, moralized, and judged, often from multiple conflicting perspectives. The narrative explores this dynamic subtly, showing how her vanishing acts are informed by an acute understanding of morality, perception, and consequence, heightening psychological tension and deepening character complexity. In addition, the narrative emphasizes the temporal dimension of her isolation. Time itself becomes a variable in suspense. Days stretch into nights with only the faintest signs of her presence, repeated patterns are disrupted, leaving observers disoriented. Even familiar routines, the ringing of church bells, the opening and closing of market stalls, the calls of laborers, become markers of uncertainty, framing her disappearance against a shifting temporal backdrop. The audience is drawn into this distorted perception of time, experiencing both anticipation and unease, understanding that the vanishing point is not merely a location but a psychological state in which presence and absence, action and inaction, fear and resolve converge. The first investigation, now frustrated by the accumulation of signs and the pregnant woman's strategic vanishing, begins to reveal systemic weaknesses. Gaps in observation, misunderstandings, and failures to coordinate searches illustrate the limitations of human authority when confronted with subtlety and cunning. The narrative treats these procedural flaws as historically grounded, enhancing suspense by showing that even those tasked with enforcing order can be confounded by careful planning, environmental factors, and the ingenuity of an individual navigating extreme circumstances. By the end of this section, the pregnant woman is fully established as both central figure and agent within the mystery. Her isolation intensifies the stakes, her vanishing maneuvers create psychological tension, and the city of Charleston emerges as a living environment that shapes both observer and observed. Suspense is maintained not through overt spectacle but through the careful interplay of perception, environment, and psychology, emphasizing the slow-burning, cerebral nature of the mystery. The narrative leaves the audience on the edge of awareness, recognizing that the vanishing point is more than a location, it is a metaphor for uncertainty, vulnerability, and the human struggle to navigate forces beyond comprehension. Isolation is not merely physical but emotional, social, and moral, framing the pregnant woman's experience as a lens through which the audience can explore fear, intelligence, and resilience. This sets the stage for the aftermath, lingering questions, and unresolved tension that will dominate the next phase of the story, maintaining engagement and deepening emotional investment in the mystery's outcome. After the pregnant woman's disappearance, Charleston settled into an uneasy rhythm. Life continued on the surface, markets opened, church bells rang, ships arrived at the harbor, but beneath this veneer of normalcy, a quiet tension lingered. The city's residents, both free and enslaved, had witnessed an event that could not be neatly explained, and the uncertainty left an imprint on the social and psychological landscape. In this section, the narrative examines the aftermath, highlighting the silence that descended over the city, the unspoken fears, and the moral and emotional consequences of a mystery that defied resolution. Authorities, frustrated by incomplete investigations and contradictory reports, gradually ceased active searches. Overseers and plantation owners returned to routines that demanded compliance and visible order, yet an unacknowledged sense of failure permeated their interactions. The narrative details the subtle signs of this tension, a gaze lingering a moment too long down an alley, a conversation cut short when a sensitive topic arose, the cautious use of language to avoid admitting uncertainty. Silence, in this context, becomes a tool, a coping mechanism, and a reflection of the limits of control, demonstrating that power alone cannot account for the unseen or the unresolved. Within the enslaved community, the aftermath carried its own weight. People who had been privy to the pregnant woman's movements or had attempted to communicate with her through coded signals were left to interpret her absence. The story emphasizes the emotional toll of these unspoken responsibilities. Guilt, worry, and relief intermingled as individuals navigated the moral and practical implications of her disappearance. The narrative dwells on these tensions, portraying a network of human observation and care that persisted despite structural oppression, yet was constrained by fear, secrecy, and social hierarchy. Rumors persisted, though they became increasingly muted, filtered through caution and uncertainty. Some whispered that she had successfully fled, finding refuge in places beyond the city's grasp. Others speculated that she had been taken by forces beyond comprehension, interpreted through spiritual or moral frameworks. The narrative explores these possibilities with subtlety, maintaining suspense while grounding the story in historical realism. The ambiguity is essential. The absence of a definitive conclusion preserves the eerie quality of the mystery and reflects the lived experience of those who endured incomplete knowledge and unresolved fear. The psychological impact of silence on the city's population was profound. Where once events had been observed, interpreted, and discussed, now there was restraint, hesitation, and an almost ritualized avoidance of certain topics. People adapted to the absence of clarity, constructing protective narratives to explain or rationalize what they could not control. The narrative describes these adaptations in detail: a hushed conversation halted by a glance, a casual remark with double meaning, a deliberate avoidance of alleys or spaces where the pregnant woman had been seen. Silence becomes a social instrument, shaping behavior and perception, and reinforcing the slow, pervasive tension that underpins the city's collective consciousness. Religious interpretation continued to influence the aftermath. Clergy offered sermons that framed the disappearance within moral and theological frameworks, emphasizing divine will, providence, or punishment. These interpretations, however, were increasingly met with internal skepticism. While outwardly reinforcing social norms, religious explanations could not fill the gaps in knowledge, leaving congregants with unresolved questions and a subtle undercurrent of fear. The narrative highlights the interplay between formal authority and private doubt, showing how moral and spiritual narratives both guided and constrained social behavior, maintaining suspense through uncertainty and partial comprehension. Physical reminders of the pregnant woman's presence remained embedded in the city. Alleyways, courtyards, and corners where she had been glimpsed continued to evoke unease. Members of the enslaved community and other observant residents noted these spaces with heightened awareness, interpreting signs and anomalies long after her disappearance. The narrative provides detailed, cinematic descriptions of these locales: sunlight falling across uneven cobblestones, the faint echo of footsteps that may or may not be real, the lingering impression of movement in otherwise still environments. These elements reinforce the persistence of mystery, showing how memory and perception contribute to the ongoing psychological tension in the city. The narrative also examines the social consequences of unspoken knowledge. Those who had attempted to assist or observe the pregnant woman experienced subtle shifts in their relationships. Trust and suspicion, solidarity and self-preservation, were constantly recalibrated. People adjusted behaviors to avoid attracting attention or being implicated in unverified stories. Silence, in this context, was not merely passive, it was a strategy, a form of protection, and a reflection of the moral ambiguity imposed by a society structured around oppression. The story emphasizes these dynamics, illustrating how unresolved mystery can shape human behavior, moral decision-making, and social interaction. Economic and labor routines resumed, but with undercurrents of apprehension. Plantation operations continued, merchants conducted transactions, and ships unloaded cargo, yet there was a sense that the normal rhythms of commerce masked an unacknowledged fragility. Supervisors and laborers alike were keenly aware of how much could occur beyond the reach of formal oversight. The narrative traces these subtle tensions, using cinematic techniques to show the contrast between outward activity and inward uncertainty. This creates an atmosphere of suspense even in mundane actions, reinforcing the story's tone and immersing the audience in the city's lingering unease. By the end of this section, Charleston exists as a city marked by absence, memory, and silence. The pregnant woman's disappearance has reshaped perception, behavior, and emotion across social strata. Suspense is maintained through unspoken questions, incomplete knowledge, and subtle environmental cues that remind the audience that the mystery has not been resolved. The narrative emphasizes the psychological and moral consequences of unacknowledged events, illustrating how silence itself can be a force that shapes human understanding and heightens tension. The aftermath is not closure but a prolonged engagement with uncertainty. The city's rhythm continues, yet every shadow, every whisper, every pause in conversation carries residual meaning. The audience is left with an understanding that the pregnant woman's story has become embedded in the fabric of Charleston, creating an enduring tension that echoes across generations. The narrative sets the stage for final reflections, theories, and lingering questions, preparing viewers to confront both the unresolved mystery and the emotional resonance it leaves behind. As Charleston settled into a fragile rhythm after the pregnant woman's disappearance, speculation continued to flourish in quiet, persistent ways. In this final section, the narrative examines the myriad theories that emerged, the questions that remained unresolved, and the emotional resonance of an event that left no clear answers. The story is not concerned with sensationalized conclusions but with the human need to interpret, to seek closure, and to grapple with uncertainty in a world that refused to yield it. Suspense is maintained even in reflection, emphasizing ambiguity, moral complexity, and the psychological depth of the city's response. Observers and authorities alike proposed a variety of explanations, each reflecting their position, biases, and limited knowledge. Some suggested that she had successfully escaped, finding a refuge beyond the city's reach. This theory acknowledged her intelligence, resilience, and capacity for strategic action, but it remained speculative. No evidence confirmed her whereabouts, and the city continued to speculate, haunted by the possibility that she had vanished without a trace. The narrative presents this as both plausible and emotionally compelling, emphasizing the courage and agency required for such an outcome in a society structured around oppression and control. Other theories leaned toward darker possibilities. Some speculated that she had fallen victim to foul play, perhaps at the hands of those intent on asserting authority or punishing perceived transgression. Rumors suggested clandestine abduction, concealment, or even death in an unobserved corner of the city. The narrative examines these possibilities with sensitivity, portraying the emotional impact of uncertainty and fear without resorting to graphic depictions. The focus is on the social and psychological consequences of unresolved danger, showing how fear and speculation shape behavior, memory, and collective conscience. Religious and moral interpretations continued to influence understanding. Clergy and moral authorities framed the event as divine judgment or providential intervention, offering explanations that could reconcile the unknown with existing moral frameworks. These interpretations provided comfort for some while leaving others unsatisfied, highlighting the limits of theology in accounting for complex, ambiguous events. The narrative emphasizes the tension between spiritual interpretation and empirical observation, showing how individuals and communities navigate uncertainty through the lens of belief, often leaving critical questions unaddressed. Folklore and legend began to take shape around the pregnant woman's disappearance. Stories circulated of her movements, her cunning, and her vanishing moments, growing with each retelling. She became both figure and symbol, representing resilience, mystery, and the human capacity to evade control. These legends, while unverified, carried emotional and cultural truth, shaping the identity of the community and the city itself. The narrative treats these developments as historically grounded phenomena, illustrating how myth and memory intersect with real events to create a layered, enduring mystery that continues to provoke reflection and speculation. The unanswered questions multiplied as observers attempted to reconcile contradictions in reports, witness testimony, and environmental cues. How had she moved undetected through a city structured for surveillance? What role had the enslaved community played in her movements, and what risks did they assume in aiding or observing her? Could the anomalies and signs be explained by coincidence, or were they deliberate acts of strategy and cunning? The narrative presents these questions with subtle tension, drawing the audience into the intellectual and emotional engagement required to appreciate the depth of uncertainty. Each unanswered question contributes to suspense and ensures that the story's resonance extends beyond the immediate events. The narrative also emphasizes the emotional legacy of unresolved mystery. Families, neighbors, and witnesses carried the psychological weight of uncertainty, shaping their interactions, choices, and perceptions. Fear, curiosity, and admiration coexisted, creating a complex social and emotional landscape. The story explores how unresolved events can leave lasting impressions, affecting behavior and memory for years, even generations. The audience is invited to reflect on the enduring human impulse to seek answers and the frustration, anxiety, and awe that accompany ambiguity. In examining final theories, the narrative juxtaposes rational and speculative interpretations. Investigators and authorities attempted to reconstruct her movements with empirical methods, relying on witness testimony, environmental observation, and procedural logic. At the same time, residents, both enslaved and free, interpreted the events through moral, spiritual, and symbolic lenses. The narrative highlights the interplay between these perspectives, showing how uncertainty allows multiple interpretations to coexist, each shaped by experience, hierarchy, and psychological need. This layered approach reinforces suspense while respecting historical realism and the story's slow-burning, contemplative tone. The city itself emerges as a silent participant in the unresolved mystery. Streets, alleys, courtyards, and plantation fields retain traces of absence and presence, memory and anticipation. Observers report lingering impressions of movement, inexplicable sounds, and fleeting shadows, yet these signs remain ambiguous. The narrative emphasizes how the environment, memory, and perception combine to sustain the mystery, creating a tension between what is known, what is assumed, and what is imagined. Charleston becomes more than a backdrop, it is an active agent in the storytelling, shaping experience, perception, and interpretation. Ultimately, the pregnant woman's disappearance remains a nexus of uncertainty. No definitive resolution is reached, and the narrative deliberately preserves ambiguity. The story leaves audiences with a complex emotional response, awe at her resourcefulness, dread at the possibilities of danger, and lingering curiosity about the forces, human, social, and environmental, that shaped the events. The narrative underscores that mystery is not merely an intellectual puzzle but an emotional and moral experience, one that challenges assumptions, evokes empathy, and sustains engagement through unresolved tension. The final reflections draw attention to the broader implications of the story. Beyond the specific events, the narrative contemplates themes of observation and oversight, power and vulnerability, human resilience, and the limitations of authority. The pregnant woman's disappearance becomes emblematic of the gaps in understanding created by social hierarchy, systemic oversight, and human psychology. Her story prompts reflection on how individuals navigate structures of power, evade control, and leave traces that defy easy comprehension. The narrative emphasizes these thematic dimensions subtly, ensuring that the audience is left contemplating both the historical and psychological resonance of the mystery. By the conclusion of this section, the pregnant woman has become a figure larger than life, her presence defined by absence, her story embedded in the collective memory of Charleston. Theories, whispers, and observations continue to coexist, unresolved and provocative. Suspense is preserved in the lingering questions and the emotional weight of ambiguity. The narrative ensures that the story's conclusion is not about revelation but about reflection, demonstrating that unresolved mystery can exert profound influence on human perception, social behavior, and emotional resonance. The final impact rests in the interplay of memory, legend, and human interpretation. Observers and audiences alike are compelled to consider the pregnant woman's intelligence, courage, and adaptability, while simultaneously confronting the limitations of authority, perception, and understanding. The narrative closes with the recognition that the story's true power lies not in closure but in the space it creates for contemplation, moral engagement, and lingering unease. Charleston, with its alleys, shadows, and echoes, becomes a living monument to mystery, and the pregnant woman's legacy endures in the questions that remain unanswered, in the tension that persists, and in the human fascination with the unknown. Even decades after the pregnant woman's disappearance, her story continued to echo through the streets of Charleston, becoming an enduring, almost spectral presence in the city's collective memory. In this section, the narrative explores the long-term psychological, cultural, and social ramifications of her vanishing, emphasizing how unresolved events imprint themselves not only on those who witnessed them but also on subsequent generations. The pregnant woman's story, though incomplete in detail, became a lens through which the city contemplated vulnerability, resilience, morality, and the unknown, creating a haunting legacy that blurred the lines between history, memory, and legend. The immediate aftermath of her disappearance left a palpable void. Streets where she had been glimpsed or traced through subtle signs, footprints, displaced objects, or shadowed corridors, carried residual unease. Even as daily life resumed, observers could not entirely dismiss the impression that her presence lingered, that she had left behind traces impossible to erase. The narrative emphasizes the physical and emotional texture of these remnants, cobblestones that retained echoes of hurried steps, rustling curtains in abandoned rooms, and courtyards where light and shadow seemed to move unpredictably. Each detail reinforces suspense, grounding it in tangible, atmospheric elements that heighten the story's slow-burning tension. Memory played a critical role in shaping her legacy. Witnesses who had encountered her, either directly or through observation, carried impressions of her movements, strategies, and resilience. These recollections, often fragmented and contradictory, were retold cautiously within the enslaved community and among the city's residents. Over time, the pregnant woman became more than an individual. She became a symbol of survival, defiance, and intelligence, embodying both the vulnerability imposed by oppression and the human capacity to navigate it with cunning and resourcefulness. The narrative treats these memories as living artifacts, demonstrating how perception, storytelling, and experience intertwine to create enduring suspense and intrigue. The legacy of her story was reinforced by folklore and legend. In the absence of concrete answers, stories flourished, evolving with each retelling. Children heard tales of a clever woman who vanished at the perfect moment, adults spoke in hushed tones about the mysterious movements that defied understanding, and elders interpreted her story as a moral or spiritual lesson. The narrative carefully presents these developments, illustrating how myth, memory, and observation coalesce to form a cultural consciousness that sustains mystery. This interplay between fact and legend preserves suspense while offering insight into the human need to interpret and find meaning in unresolved events. Religious and moral frameworks continued to shape interpretations of her disappearance. Clergy and moral authorities referenced her story in sermons and teachings, framing it as an example of divine will, moral consequence, or providential mystery. These interpretations, while comforting to some, could not resolve the gaps in knowledge or fully explain the anomalies surrounding her movements. The narrative emphasizes the tension between faith and observation, showing how moral and spiritual narratives attempt to provide coherence to events that resist simple explanation, and how these attempts contribute to the ongoing psychological and cultural resonance of her story. Psychological and emotional consequences persisted across social layers. For members of the enslaved community who had observed or assisted her, the story became a point of reflection, caution, and sometimes pride. For authorities and city residents, it remained a source of unease, a reminder of the limits of control and understanding. The narrative explores these effects in cinematic detail, the careful avoidance of certain alleys, the quiet observation of familiar courtyards, and the lingering tension in conversations that reference her story indirectly. These subtleties reinforce the haunting quality of her legacy, maintaining suspense and emotional engagement long after the events themselves. The city itself became a repository for the pregnant woman's story. Charleston streets, alleys, courtyards, and plantation fields acted as silent witnesses, retaining the imprint of events in ways both physical and psychological. Observers reported fleeting shadows, inexplicable sounds, or the sensation of being watched, suggesting that her story had transformed the environment into an active participant in the narrative. The narrative presents these phenomena with subtlety, grounding them in perception and memory rather than overt supernatural intervention, which preserves realism while enhancing the story's eerie, slow-burning atmosphere. Historical records, fragmentary as they were, reinforced the sense of enduring mystery. Journals, letters, and oral histories occasionally referenced her disappearance, each account filtered through time, bias, and interpretation. The narrative examines how gaps, inconsistencies, and omissions in documentation both frustrated attempts at definitive understanding and contributed to the story's power. Suspense is maintained by emphasizing the tension between recorded history and lived experience, illustrating how absence and partial knowledge sustain intrigue across generations. The pregnant woman's legacy also influenced social and moral consciousness. Her actions, her disappearance, and the mystery surrounding them became cautionary tales and examples of strategic resilience, shaping perceptions of agency, risk, and morality. The narrative explores the layered meanings attributed to her story, showing how it became a tool for reflection, teaching, and communal understanding. The ambiguity of her fate allows multiple interpretations to coexist, deepening suspense while also highlighting the complexity of human behavior and ethical consideration in a society defined by inequality and oversight. Finally, the narrative reflects on the enduring emotional resonance of unresolved mystery.